Hello.
Hey, how's it going, Nora?
I cannot hear you, but I need to set myself up to make sure that it's not on my end.
Okay, you should be able to hear me. I'm seeing I'm seeing a little green movement on my microphone when I talk.
Hello. Yes. No,
Okay, good.
anyway, I don't know why, but until I get my headphones on, sometimes it's like no sound. So
Yeah,
yeah.
sometimes that's how it works. Yeah,
I
that's
guess so.
true.
What the fuck?
How,
How you doing?
doing very well, Nora. Thanks for coming on to talk to me. How are you
Yeah,
doing?
man. I'm great. I'm really good.
Have you been watching the new Game of Thrones thing? Are you into that stuff at all? No, nothing.
No.
No dragon
I
bullshit for you.
watched I watched old Game of Thrones. But I figured the new one would be closer to the later part of the series, which sucked. So I was like, not interested in it, you
I
know?
I would I'm recommending it to people. I'm trying to get people
Oh, is that
involved
right?
because I'm getting hyped up, getting into the Game of
Mm,
Thrones discourse again and doing all that stuff.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
kind of getting excited about it again. So I'm trying to get other people involved so they can be excited too.
yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, well, I'll take that under advice.
Okay, good. That's fair. That's all I can ask.
Yeah.
Um so Nora, thanks for joining me on the stream today. So the reason I wanted to talk to you, Nora, I mean there's a number of things we can get into here, but we just had this Quebec election. And I've been very disconnected from it just because it seemed so like predictable and depressing. I've not really engaged with it that much, but I
Yeah.
did want to, I fucking live here and it's important to talk about. And I know that you're probably more engaged with it than I am. And I wanted to take a little bit more time to try and understand these results and try and understand and explain to people who don't live here, what the political culture
Hmm.
here is about and what just happened in this recent election. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess just starting off, like were you surprised by the results of this election? It seemed kind of foreshadowed, and it seemed clear what was going to happen. But what was
Yeah.
your takeaway when it was kind of immediately called for another majority for the CAC?
Well, I did an election special, and we called it for the CAC, I think, before the polls closed. So very proudly able to make that call very
Nice.
early on in the night. Yeah, all of the polls indicated what happened, so there was absolutely no surprises at all. I personally wasn't surprised whatsoever with any of the results, and in the results where it was like disappointing or a bit of a change to the status quo, I think each of those kind of definitely merit their own conversations. But, the CAC is extremely popular. This is a premier who had higher than 50% approval ratings for the first time in the history of the province since there was more than two parties. And he was receiving that kind of support by fall 2020. So we've already gone through like the biggest, most intense period of mass death within the pandemic. Of course, death has continued, but like not certainly not the institutional death that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic in a lot of old age homes in this province. And still, Quebecers were willing to give this guy, 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10. Now, I think it's easy to forget that people still have a lot of anger towards the Liberals, as they should. The Liberals were in power almost uninterrupted for 15 years. And I mean, they were interrupted by a period of 18 months for a minority government that was run by a minority PQ government. And so I think that Quebecers quite rightly understand that the vast majority of our problems result from governance decisions made by the Liberals and not the CAC. And that gave Francois Legault a lot of cover. People love having like a strong father figure in this province as the head of government. And he was able to increase that vote share from 74 in 2018 up to 90.
Yeah. That's kind of one of the things we've been talking about. It's been really amazing that regardless of whatever, because like I understand that they are really popular, and you can
Yeah.
kind of make sense of why that is, but regardless of any of the missteps when it comes to COVID, how, I mean, I think I've talked with you about before, how there's been this like really low bar for conservative leaders across the country, that it's so easy for them to sail under just by kind of following basic health guidelines. But of course you had our weird pandemic curfew situation that happened, which was not backed by science in any way. That was very unpopular, and a number of things that they really fucked up during this period, but it didn't really seem to infect them in any way.
Well, it's funny though, because the only people that remind me about the curfew are Montrealers. Like, no one in my regular life is like, oh man, remember when the CAC imposed the curfew on us? And it's such an interesting cultural. I mean, it's not like it was a good idea, and it's not like it saved any lives at all. As you say, like science was certainly not conclusive on that measure being necessary. But it impacted Montrealers in a totally different way than it impacted folks in Quebec City, and I suspect in other places too. And I think that that's one of many examples of things that you should be outraged by, but that people really weren't outraged by, like that really didn't impact them in a way that would motivate them to vote against the CAC. And, that being said, like the opposition parties did get more votes than the CAC got. If you look at them combined, their votes just weren't efficient. They weren't located in such a way that would give them the number of seats that the CAC got. So we're also dealing with a system that privileges fake majorities, which is what the CAC got. And they didn't just get a fake majority, but they had a fake blowout. Now, they would have still made government had we had some sort of proportional representation system. But, but it's over amplified based on how the system works in this province and in this country.
Yeah. And just in terms of the curfew and everything, like that's the thing in terms of, I'm a Montrealer, it didn't really affect me. I don't really ever leave my house at night anyways.
Right.
But it just seemed like an example of a totally kind of incoherent public health policy that didn't really seem to affect them in any way. But it totally affected me. I was skiing every night. And so then once the 8:00 curfew came on, I was like, I couldn't ski anymore. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is the safest fucking activity. Like, I'm by myself and I'm outside. And so honestly, when the second curfew came in, it was bumped up to 10. I was like, oh, thank God I can at least go ski. But but there's a psychological difference in the rest of the province. And I think that it was seen as a measure that was necessary, like regardless of fact. And people weren't actually that bothered by it, clearly. I mean, because that's the kind of measure that could have probably sunk the leadership of a government if people were really, really mad about it, right? Yeah. Can you tell people that are not from Quebec a little bit more about the CAC? Because it is kind of an interesting coalition, isn't it? Like, they are a conservative party in many ways, but because of Quebec's kind of somewhat unique political culture, sometimes they have to lean in these different directions or do things that you don't really expect from conservative parties. Legault is kind of a populist, right, in many ways. So I just want to explain a little bit about what makes the CAC different from like other conservative parties that we're used to hearing about.
Oh yeah, I would say that they're not even. I think that they're more liberal than they are conservative, frankly. And it's just the fact that we came through liberal rule that makes it a little hard to see that, because they are conservative for sure, but they're not doing anything more conservative than the liberals did. Like, unless there's something I'm not thinking of. So the CAC comes out of, they were a splinter group from the Parti Québécois. And François Legault founded Air Transat. So he runs the party like a CEO. You can see that evidence of that is everywhere. And they wanted to be a party of like business values and that kind of thing. And I think that as they got closer and closer to power, they did just take that role that the Liberals held, very friendly to business and very close to capital. But Legault is a true populist. I mean, this is a government that spent more money than ever before on surveys. And I mean, I don't have a doubt in my mind that if you name the issue, if there was overwhelming support for it in the province, Legault would do it. Like, he's not ideological in a political, in a left right kind of way. He's just like a guy that wants to keep managing things properly. And if tomorrow every single Quebecer came out and was like, I don't know, like get rid of Law 21, which is the law that bans certain public servants from wearing religious symbols, I mean, he would drop it. This is all about him trying to just appease the majority on every single issue. And, that's frustrating because the majority opinion on a lot of issues is fucking bad. But it's also an opportunity because it means that we really can push this government in certain ways. There's like, they had a majority government, and the number of the reforms that they wanted to push through. And I'm thinking specifically, I mean, I'm not going to go into the reform because it's quite complicated, but the reform around the construction industry, they could have pushed it through, and they had no opposition in government to stop it. But there was enough of a fight mounted by the opposition parties and by industry and by workers, mostly by workers, that they didn't. So it's an interesting political formation. They've taken that spot of the liberals. I really can't tell you how different they are than the liberals. Like they really aren't. Maybe on a question of English language, that's the only thing. But even on minority rights, like the liberals were trying to ban niqab from receiving people who wear niqab from receiving public services. I mean, it's the same freaking thing. Like it's actually worse in a lot of ways. So yeah, they're an interesting political beast. A lot of people I think are reading them a little bit wrong. But there are a lot of parallels between what's happening now and the government of Maurice Duplessis in the 1940s and early 50s, where Duplessis really ran Quebec like a kingdom. He's like top guy in his world. And I think that there are a lot of parallels to that because Legault is a strong man, which is also a weakness because if he were to die tomorrow, the CAC would absolutely not be able to survive losing their CEO. There's no, like, he's the linchpin in this whole experiment.
I think comparing them to the liberals is interesting as well. And this is something that I saw you were talking about in the day after the election. Is there's usage, and there's somewhat cynical usage of this kind of like identity politics.
Yeah.
And how they've got the First Nations assemblywoman is part of the CAC. They have the largest Black caucus, I think, in the National Assembly. They've really embraced the use of this kind of like of a very liberal version of identity politics in order to advance this agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's really fascinating, and I think it also just demonstrates that that as much as we want to paint them as just true to the bone racists, and certainly like many of them are, absolutely. And they use racism and they use identity politics to ignore, to hide kind of the some of the stuff that they want hidden. We also have to remember though that they're trying to be this economically minded centrist government, and it appeals to a lot of people regardless of identity. Like one of the weirdest experiences I had was talking to someone who just couldn't understand why the members of his mosque were all in for the CAC. And this is like Legault denies the existence of Islamophobia in Quebec. I mean, he says he does. I think that this is all a show. The guy knows very well that this is Islamophobia here. But at the mosque where there was the shooting in Quebec City, people would still vote for the CAC. So I think that the economic interest really plays quite heavily, and this is where comparisons to the liberals is very interesting. I mean, the real difference is like the liberals were run by doctors. The top three ministers in the Liberal government, most of them were doctors. Well, all except the Minister of Finance, they were doctors, like medical doctors. And the CAC are all businessmen. So it's just kind of like two sides of the same coin. And then they're very, very, very good at solidifying their support by using these identity issues, considering that there's just such a massive difference between racial identity in Montreal and the rest of the province, which is also a unique thing to Quebec, where, most of Canada, the rest of Canada, immigrants will live in many communities in provinces. They are not going to only live in the Edmontons or the Reginas or the Torontos of the world. They'll live in smaller towns. They'll live in smaller cities. That's not how it works in Quebec. 80% of immigrants go to Montreal. And that's just a recipe for social discohesion, because you have all of these people in the province that just have no interaction at all with immigration. And then everything they hear about Montreal from their local news is negative and plays on racist stereotypes. So not that you get rid of racism by, making sure that immigration happens everywhere. Of course, there's still lots of other things you have to do, but that's a basic one, and it really changes how people interact in this province with Montreal, outside of Montreal, and then with their government. Because for people that haven't looked at the results very closely, the entire island of Montreal, except for one riding, voted against this government.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty stunning. But we have to also say that the CAC antagonized Anglophones. And that, I guess, is one cardinal rule that you do not do if you ever want to win in Anglophone Montreal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the things that's been frustrating, I think, over the last couple of years, not just in Quebec or not just but across Canada and across all countries that have these kind of neoliberal or conservative governments, is just the fact that, like, regardless of whatever mistakes that have been made with COVID or with other things, with the decreasing standard of living, decreasing availability of public goods, the healthcare system, and all this stuff, it's been an amazing opportunity for the left to organize around. And I think the frustrating thing when it comes to the NDP, federally, or QS here in Quebec Solidaire, it just seems like there's been this missed opportunity to take all these things that animate people, and to translate that into increasing their coalition and increasing their movement. And it seemed like, even though it wasn't a terrible result for QS, it does seems like they've been kind of treading water, and they've had this inability to get beyond where they were previously. Like, is that your read from what's been going on with QS over the last couple of years and in this election?
I think that we have to put QS into context. And the context is that you've got this massive hegemonic power in the CAC, and they've got tons of support everywhere. And QS is trying to do many things at once. They're trying to be the official opposition for all Quebecers. The reality is that they're only located in major city centers. And so they really do have legitimacy to talk about urban issues. QS is the only voice in Quebec City that will stand up and say we're against the Troisième Lien, which is this hilarious plan to put a tunnel between our shore and the south shore of the St. Lawrence at Lévis. They're the party that really fought the CAC into forcing them to support the tramway project, which now they do, and it's going on. So they have to do that while also finding those issues outside of the urban centers that they can support. And what's really tough is you look at the deputy that just lost her seat in Abitibi, right, Emily's, and she's been the biggest advocate for air quality and health reforms in her community, because there's a huge smelting factory, the Horn Foundry, that is poisoning the people that live there. And like, her activism and the party's activism has brought this to the fore. And then what happens? She loses her seat. And I think that's probably because industry was like, oh, hell no. Right. Yeah. Whereas you have Sol Zanetti, who has a similar situation with massive pollution within his riding, and it's much higher than anywhere else in the province, other than in Abitibi. And the difference there is just that it's more diverse. It's not one corporation, it's many corporations, and it's more diffuse. And, he was able to hang on to a seat, but it wasn't a washout either. I mean, the CAC was very close, and they didn't even participate in any debates. So I think, like, we have to remember that QS is not only trying to be a political party. Like, this is the NDP is always just trying to be a political party. They don't care. Like, they're trying to just be the Liberals. They're hiding under coats, and they're hoping that when the musical chairs ends, they've managed to get that last seat. That's literally their election strategy. And QS doesn't do that. And the more that the QS goes towards that communications slick kind of style of politics, the worse it's going to get. But there are things that unblock things within QS that I think are hard to see until you see them. So the last time there was something that moved QS into a position where they were getting elected off of the island of Montreal, and a lot of Montrealers disagree with this or didn't see it in this way, but I mean, I'd love to have that argument with them, was that they merged with a very small, insignificant party called Option Nationale, but that party had tons of artists in it. And so the 2018 election, there was art, beautiful videos, beautiful posters, beautiful pancarts, all indicating that there was artistic presence within QS, which there had never been before. And it was one of the things that was enough to really launch people into getting elected, certainly getting elected in Quebec City. And I would also say kind of it helped the whole broader look of the party. What will it be for the next the next kind of iteration of QS, I mean, they have to continue the grassroots mobilization. They have to get much closer to social movement organizations that are doing like anti-poverty work and other work like that. I mean, the environmental side, they're pretty close already. So I think that that's really good. Anti-racism work, they're not. That has to happen. But we have to not see this as being every single election. Why isn't QS getting more seats? Because there are other political factors that need to fall into place for that to happen. And I think that what we're seeing is an advancement more on future elections than this one. I mean, I could have told you in 2019 that the CAQ was going to win a majority just because they were handed a pile of shit from the Liberals and had total plausible deniability.
Yeah.
And the Liberals were collapsing. So who else is going to be the option? So it'll be interesting to see how QS plays this. I think it's also worth noting they just got three new MNAs who are politically radical with a lot of experience dealing with political, like the functioning of the state, which I think is going to be a huge benefit to them. And we saw, QS was number 2 in the votes. Right. So
that's what I wanted to point out too. It's like we can talk about failures of QS for their inability to grow from where they were, but they're literally like in terms of the actual vote share, they should by rights be the opposition party. They got way more votes from the Liberals and 10 seats less than the Liberals. It's a total failure of our democratic system. The fact that they're relegated to this kind of more irrelevant third party status when they really shouldn't be.
Yeah, and they received fewer votes than in 2018, but not by much. Like it basically is the same. I mean, we're talking about maybe I think a few hundred votes fewer than in 2018. But there was presence. Like there was talk of maybe QS could break through in Saint Francois, right, in the Chaudière-Appalaches, or maybe they could break through in Hull, right, in the eastern part of the western part of the province. Or in Rimouski, right, where Carolyn CAQ had some very hilarious plays on her last name because her last name is the same as the CAQ. I mean, like just awesome, right? But but QS is going to be responding to where social movements are. Like that's how the party is set up, and they need to continue to bring forth the demands of social movements to be able to bring political expression to the demands from the street. That's a huge challenge. And I hope that they're up for that challenge. It's going to get more difficult. And I know people were hoping to see more seats and not just one more seat. I mean, by all measures, that's not a huge success, obviously. But we're in a province where the pendulum shifts. Pendulum swings is how Quebec politics works.
We all remember the famous NDP election in Quebec. Overnight, all of Quebec decided to vote for the NDP and then decided again never to do it again immediately afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the NDP did fuck all to try and save their seats here either, right? Like that was the interesting thing of it was the NDP was like, oh, wow, they must love us. It's like, that's literally not how Quebec works. They don't love you. They really hate Stephen Harper is what's going on here. But this is the province that birthed a political party from nothing to full government in 6 years, right? With the foundation of the Parti Québécois. We're far from that era. But if people keep making these comparisons with Maurice Duplessis, I think what is very interesting is what's the backlash going to look like? You have an entire young generation of Quebecers, especially Montrealers, who will be taking radical action as they get older. And I think that has incredible potential. When I was organizing in Quebec Solidaire to change the position on religious symbols, because QS, like so many other progressive organizations, unions, the women's movement or whatever, their position on religious symbols went back to a huge commission that 2 philosophers held. I mean, this is so Quebec. I love it. It's the biggest commission since the Commission on Independence. And the philosophers were listening to all the sides of what people wanted. Full ban like France, not a full ban, this kind of thing. And they decided that they'd come up with this compromise. And the compromise was banning in some public sector jobs. And very much like cops, crown prosecutors, judges, some politicians, not even all, like the Speaker of the National Assembly. Anyway, ridiculous. They have since denounced that position. This happened in 2008. So when I was part of the movement that changed QS's position away from the Bouchard-Taylor compromise, I watched people's position change. Like I was in debates where we were like, this is like, argue, argue, argue. And then they would walk out of the debate in it with a changed perspective. And that just is a political culture that I have never seen anywhere else in Canada. And so I think that like that gives me a lot of hope. There is always interesting debates that could be had in this province, and there always are interesting debates that can be had in this province. And I think that like how QS will navigate itself as being the de facto official opposition, because the Liberals are in complete shambles. They're not going to be, they haven't been the official opposition. They're not going to be the official opposition going forward. They lost more than half of the votes that they had in 2018. And so that'll be very, very interesting. Of course, the flip side to all of this is the rise of the far right. And while they were shut out of any seats, they got a hell of a lot of votes, and they really should have gotten seats. I mean, if we had a system that was fair, they would have had some seats. And I think that they'll be able to make a lot of hay off of that, which will be really difficult.
Yeah. And I think one thing could be interesting, talking about QS moving forward, is I think like, because I think that becomes kind of an albatross on their neck when they become the party exclusively of the urban kind of intellectual academic crowd. There were a couple of ridings like in these northern Quebec towns, like mining towns, which the CAQ carried, where they had a really strong showing though. And I think that's one thing that could be interesting, seeing if they can kind of expand beyond how they're kind of known as being this kind of urban intellectual party and going into these more rural communities and organizing with workers there that are clearly affected by a lot of these, the way that our economy is being run right now. I don't know if that's going to happen overnight, but that was one thing that, even though, you could frame the result as being somewhat disappointing, you saw that it seems like they're making inroads in some of those places, which is something that you would hope would continue moving forward, right?
Well, and that started in 2018. In 2018, QS was the number one vote for all Indigenous communities in the province.
Yeah.
They don't have the ability to sway the non-Indigenous communities that they share the ridings with. I haven't seen the votes from this election yet. I don't know. I imagine it's probably the same thing, if not similar. So there is a possibility. What the problem is I think that people really have faith in François Legault making everything better. Things are really bad. Things are differently bad based on where you are in this province, and people have faith in François Legault to make things better. And in Quebec and in France and in the French legal tradition, there's this idea of like the responsibility of a good father. It's literally called le bon père famille, and Legault completely embodies that. He completely embodies the bon père famille model, and that speaks to a lot of Quebecers. And then on top of that, then he heaps on racism. Then he heaps on, well, we're protecting the French language by doing all this stuff to Anglophones. And it works because people are very afraid. Like people are afraid that they're going to lose French language, and they're going to lose French culture, and that French culture is under attack because it is always under attack. I mean, English hegemony is really powerful in North America. So it'll be interesting. The other interesting thing, of course, is that the PQ also plays on a lot of these themes, and they're pretty much dead in the water. I mean, they elected their leader, which is a huge victory for them. Their caucus got cut down by more than half. They're only at 3 seats, and they couldn't be more regional. I mean, they're in Matane-Matapédia, which is that way, almost at the end of the, where the St. Lawrence goes into the sea, and Île-de-la-Madeleine, which is like an archipelago that is in the middle of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, like really closer to PEI than to Quebec. And that's the PQ. That's where the PQ like has its power, other than Pierre Saint-Paul Plamondon, who's got a riding in Montreal. I don't think the PQ is going to survive. I think the Liberals will be fine. I don't see the exit strategy for the PQ because there is no political space for their politics anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that seems to be the writing on the wall for them, which is really interesting phenomenon. Yeah. It is funny seeing how that the Liberals still have this big base in Montreal and elsewhere. It's just like you'd think that people would eventually move on from that as well. I don't know any of these Liberal voters in Quebec, but I don't know what's going on with them. But
it's amazing, right? Because you look at Ontario, where when the Liberals are decimated in Ontario, they literally only get 7 seats. Yeah. But in Montreal, the loyalty to the Liberal Party is so intense. And I know a lot of Montrealers that really thought that the two startup protest parties, the Bloc Montreal and then the Anglophone Canadian Federalist group, or whatever the hell, Constantius group, that they might have actually taken enough seats, enough votes within some of these hardcore liberal ridings to, knock the Liberals out and have the second place win. But it's kind of like fiction, right? It's fantasy thinking. Like the loyalty that these people have in some of these ridings to a federal Canada. I mean, that's deep. It goes super, super deep.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that are also the ones who are most pissed about the language law changes, which as an Anglophone outside of Montreal, I mean, doesn't really make a huge difference in my life. Actually makes almost no difference in my life.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of difference in my life either. Although it is changing things for kids and their ability to choose which CEGEPs they want to go to and stuff, which does affect my kids and stuff. It's more just frustrating to me that there's still this kind of like French English dichotomy, which it seems like a lot of the younger generations have completely moved on from, and no one really cares. And just the fact that we're still kind of talking about this shit is more the thing that I find frustrating. Not that I'm totally being impacted personally by a lot of this stuff, it's just a general sense of frustration that this is still going on.
Well, I mean, the language is a huge issue. It's a huge, huge, huge issue. And I mean, Montreal to me is like I've never lived in Montreal. Montreal to me is like the greatest city in the world, and I love it. And I've always had great times when I go, and I've been a million times. And I was there 2 days ago. And most people in the province are oriented towards Montreal in some way. Either like their kids lived there, or maybe they went to university there, or whatever. Right? Like Montreal's a huge, huge presence in the province. But like the problem with something like Bill 96 is that the biggest issues in it are the exigencies it places on immigrants to learn French and how fast they have to learn French. That's obviously bullshit. And the attack on Indigenous languages. But the Anglophone community is not concerned about Bill 96 because of those two things. They're concerned about Bill 96 because they think it's an attack on their inherent right as Anglophones to get services in English. And it's like, it's so funny because when I was in Montreal, I'm in a bar and I'm talking to the bartender, and they're all francophones, and I'm speaking French, but they can tell I'm an Anglophone, and they won't speak to me in French. It's like if I'm like where I live in my day-to-day life, I would never talk to a bartender in English. Never, never, never. It would just, it's like, wait, why did you do that? Like, you don't need to practice. Here, people want to practice. That's a whole other thing. So, I think that it is fair for people to feel like French is under attack in a city like Montreal because it is so English in parts of the city. I mean, there's parts that aren't English at all.
Yeah.
And it's also very difficult to learn French if you live in Montreal because people keep switching to you in English, and it's very, very hard to just immerse yourself. And you will know that a million times better than I know that. But like the idea for me as an Anglophone that I deserve services at my local hospital in English is like the guy that speaks Spanish, the woman that speaks Arabic, like they don't have the same rights. Like, why the hell do I have that right? That doesn't make any sense. And I think that the language, because like people have such hangovers over history, and that is most acutely represented in these pockets of the West Island of Montreal. Then you'll see that, the Liberals can literally shoot a man dead in the middle of the street in downtown Montreal, and they'll be like,
yeah,
still got to vote for them.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your take on that because it's different from what we normally hear when you get into this kind of discourse. I don't want to keep you too much longer, Nora. This is more of a quick hit, but federally, are you buying into the Poilievre mania? Do you think this is the guy? Do you think this is the guy that's going to lead this conservative movement and is going to dethrone Trudeau, whether Trudeau runs again or whether it's going to be against Freeland? Do you think Pierre Poilievre has the sauce to actually dethrone the liberal ruling order right now? Do you think Peel has any credibility when he talks about these kind of economic issues, the kitchen table issues or whatever bullshit it is, even though he obviously benefits from all and has been a part of that exact status quo for his whole career? Do you think Pierre Poilievre has the juice to become the leader of this country?
I mean, the idea of him having any juice makes me want to vom.
Yeah, that's pretty gross. Now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, that's pretty disgusting.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's horrifying.
Yeah,
this is a guy who's a campus Tory, and never grew up. Went right from campus organizing at the University of Calgary to the safe conservative seat in the Ottawa Valley, and has never left. Right. It's hard to say that it's impossible for him to get elected because nothing's impossible and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, he's trying to be a showman. Like, he's trying to come off as some sort of like Trump-esque showman, but has none of the like actually funny things about him that Trump did.
No, not at all.
Like, I don't think Paulie ever knows how to crack a joke. And he certainly doesn't know how to say something that's funny by accident. And that's all kind of like charm. He's worked on having charm. He's worked on trying to fake authenticity. But it's awesome when he's talking about like the cost of living going up, and therefore it's Justin Trudeau's fault and not landlords' faults like him, because he's a landlord.
Yeah.
So where does this put us? I mean, I think that the Liberals are salivating over a Poilievre Freeland showdown. I think that that's what they want. I think that that would be the easiest for them to play. And I do not think that Poilievre does have the stuff to beat the current Liberals. They're too organized. They're not collapsing.
It's kind of whoever wins, we lose type situation when you talk about that.
Yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing too is like there's a couple of forces that don't care about who the conservative leader is that we need to consider in Canada. One of those forces is that historically Ontarians will never support a federal government that they have in Toronto. And so by that historical logic, like literally you can go back in history, it's only happened a couple of times. It's only happened for a period of a few months. By that logic, as long as Doug Ford is the Premier of Ontario, Poilievre will likely not be the Prime Minister of Canada. And partly that's because there's just so many like people required to make him a success. They're all working for Doug Ford right now. It's the same thing that happened between the Kathleen Wynne, the Dalton McGuinty machine moving to Ottawa and becoming the Justin Trudeau machine. That's all the same people. And when that machine left Ontario, the Liberals collapsed. So that's a huge logistical, bureaucratic, and political cultural reason that Poilievre could be the most effective guy in the world and would still be very unlikely for him to be able to be elected prime minister. The other big fucking wild card is Quebec. Yep. And while Poilievre tried to suck up, and probably to some extent did successfully suck up to Eric Duhem in the Conservative Party in this province, which is of course brand new. They went from nowhere to actual like running a proper campaign, getting a lot of votes. The Bloc has worked very hard to keep itself aligned with the CAQ. And so in an election between Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, which is really just a proxy between the Conservatives and the CAQ, I think the CAQ still wins. And you can't just have 11 seats in Quebec to be the Prime Minister of Canada. You need to have many, many more than that. There are 88 seats up for grabs in this province. So I like to look at it more like the Moneyball approach than is this guy got the charisma to actually do it. I don't think he has I don't think the stars are aligned yet for him to be able to do it, but I also don't think he's going anywhere. So can he wait it out and eventually become prime minister? I think totally. Yeah.
Well, pretty horrible outcome for all of us, regardless of whether he does or doesn't. Yeah. But thanks, Nora. I didn't want to keep you too much longer. I really appreciate being able to get in touch with you again and hear you break this stuff down. Thank you again for coming to talk to me, Nora. It was always a pleasure.
Anytime.
Great. Do you want to plug your stuff before we go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. You can check out my podcast with Sandy Hudson called Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. This week we talk about Iran and what does it mean for Canada? What does it mean for Canada, but what do we do about it? Anyway, whatever.
Yeah.
You can check that out at sandynora.com, sandyandnora.com. And then you can check out what I'm writing in a lot of different places, including my Substack, noraloreto.substack.com. And my doorbell just rang, so I'm gonna
Perfect timing. Thanks, Nora. We'll talk to you soon.